The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
80% of Canadians still drive to their regular commute. Only 20% of us take transit or walk. It's the reverse in Tokyo. And so why can't Toronto be like Tokyo? Well, there's some good political reasons probably for that we can get into, but the reality is it's still an 80-20 split, which means it's too hard to get around.
Then, later on The Agenda.
We humans, when we are tested, we sometimes are capable of extraordinary resilience and strength and courage and magnanimity. And so the challenges around us are very real.
Geographically, Ontario is bigger than Spain and France combined, making travel across the province especially problematic. Getting around means taking the car, and even that can be difficult when the roads are in poor shape. And what if you don't own a car? How do you get from Toronto to Thunder Bay anyway, or Windsor to Timmins? Why is transportation in this province so difficult, and what can be done to get people moving? Let's ask. Wendy Landry, she is the mayor of Shunia, a municipality just outside of Thunder Bay. She's also president of the Northwestern Ontario Municipal Association and co-chair of the Northern Ontario Transportation Task Force. In North Bay, Ontario, Eric Boutillier, journalist and columnist for Northern Tracks. And with us here in the studio, Josipa Petrunic, president and CEO of the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium, and Eric Miller, professor of civil engineering and director of the University of Toronto Mobility Network. And we are happy to welcome you two back to our studio here in Toronto. And Your Worship and Eric and Points Beyond, thank you for joining us on the agenda tonight as well. I'm going to start with a real smart aleck question. Josipa, how'd you get here today?
Transit.
You did?
Transit.
Which one? What'd you take?
It was an epic journey, but one that I take regularly, which is taking a train from St. Catharines, where I was this morning, to Union Station, and taking a subway up.
And the subway up.
Yeah.
How do you, okay, from home in St. Catharines to what, train station?
Correct,
How'd
Union
you get there?
Station.
No.
To get there, that's a good point. That was an Uber, because I don't have a car.
Uber, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
right.
Eric, how about you?
Subway. I walked up to the Broadview station, line 2 to line 1, and got here on time. The TTC actually was on time.
Was on time. Well, that happens. You shouldn't sound so surprised. It does happen. Your Worship, Mayor Landry, if you had to get to our studio today from Thunder Bay, how would you do it?
I would have drove from Shunia to the Thunder Bay Airport. I would have taken a flight, probably Porter, to downtown Toronto, and then taken a taxi or an Uber from the airport to your studio.
Or you could have just driven, and that would have taken, what, 24 hours or so?
About 14, 15 hours.
Oh, piece of cake. Not nearly so bad. Okay.
Yeah.
Eric, how about you from North Bay? If you had to come down here from North Bay, how would you do it?
Well, maybe in a few years, I might take the Northlander and come down to Union Station and then connect to the TVO studios. But right now, I'd probably drive just because of it's just the simplest way at this point.
And Mayor Landry, if you had to get to, let's say you were going to one of your Northern Ontario Mayors Association conferences, and let's say they had it in Timmins, how would you get there from Thunder Bay?
I would probably drive. It would be quicker. Otherwise, my options are to fly to Toronto and wait for Bearskin or a Porter to Timmins.
Seriously, so you might fly from Thunder Bay to Toronto to Timmins? That might be a way to get there?
Might be safer if it's wintertime, depending on the season.
Interesting. Okay. Eric Miller, follow up on all of this if you would. We are, transit if you can, but as we've heard, transit is not always an option for all people under all circumstances. Do we still overwhelmingly live in a province that is focused on the car and car culture?
Well, yes, we are, because we haven't invested within urban areas in urban transit, and we've failed to provide intercity public transport in a very, very effective way. We've been talking about in the Toronto-Montreal corridor, Ottawa corridor, high-speed rail for over 50 years. Mm-hmm. There was a study in 1969 looking at it, and we've been talking about it ever since. And we have failed to deliver alternatives. And the bus industry has been in decline for a number of years in the province as well. So people just don't have alternatives in most cases. You have to drive 4, 5, 6 hours. Well, that's what you do because there isn't an alternative.
Josipa, how would you characterize the ease with which people can get around this province of Ontario?
Yeah, well, very difficult, but I would say there's some beacon lights of hope, perhaps, within that. To your point, Eric, busing has dropped off when we're talking about coach busing, but services like Flix have stepped in to fill the gap with the Greyhound exit. Having said that, public transit is on the rise. We're hitting pre-pandemic and have already busted through pre-pandemic levels in cities like Brampton and other cities around the country.
The ridership is coming back.
The ridership's coming back. So clearly transit is playing a role. It is growing, and we expect transit to double in size in the next decade or so because of electrification. But having said that, when we are talking about commuting and mobility, just to set in context, 80% of Canadians still drive to their regular commute. Only 20% of us take transit or walk. It's the reverse in Tokyo. And so why can't Toronto be like Tokyo? Well, there's some good political reasons probably for that we can get into, but the reality is it's still an 80-20 split, which means it's too hard to get around.
Eric Boutillier, how does it work in North Bay? If you've got to go somewhere, are public transit options at all available there, or how significant are they?
If you're traveling within the city, public transit is while limited is available. The moment you try to step out of city limits is when it becomes challenging because there really isn't any sort of connected network. To connect you to smaller communities that surround North Bay. And certainly intercity transit is sparse, very limited here in Northern Ontario.
How much bus or train service is left in Northern Ontario, in your view?
It's almost non-existent. I mean, you have a train that goes from Sudbury to White River 3 times a week. You have the transcontinental train that goes from Toronto to Vancouver through places like Sudbury, Horn, Payne, Sioux Lookout twice a week. You have train service between Cochrane and Moosonee a few times a week. Bus service maybe once a day, depending on where you live. So it's a real fragmented system. There's very little ways to connect in between those different modes, and it's a challenge, quite frankly.
Mayor Landry, how safe are the transportation options in Northern Ontario?
So when we talk about the transit system in the city is limited to the city of Thunder Bay. And again, just like Eric was saying, that it's within the city limits. And you can, those folks that take the city transit here in Thunder Bay are usually the folks that don't own a vehicle or don't have a vehicle or they're new to the area. And it's time consuming to get across the city with the transit system here. If you're inter-community commuting between our communities, then it's extremely limited with the loss of Greyhound. That was a huge loss for all of our communities. And we have limited options. The Northlander comes through now occasionally. And some places when it comes through, it's pick up at 3 a.m, all hours of the night. And if you want to go to any of the communities that are off the highway, there's some offers of private transit, like Casper buses, and some municipalities have received funding for some of the ability to bring seniors to the city of Thunder Bay for doctor's appointments and stuff. But it's traveling in between our communities are very long, very boring. It's a lot of trees.
Oh, it looks beautiful, though. Okay, hang on, Your Worship. What do you mean boring? It looks beautiful up there.
Dangerous.
Okay, well, let me follow up on that.
Hypnotizing.
Okay, let me follow up on that. You said it's dangerous. If you're driving in the city of Thunder Bay, and of course, roads are an issue, weather can be an issue, what's it like?
Well, the city of Thunder Bay, I mean, they do a good job in the snow clearing, but it takes time, right? If you get 12 inches of snow, which is not uncommon in an evening, it takes time to get all of our roads cleared. And I mean, I don't want to speak for specifically the city of Thunder Bay, but for those that are traveling in from the outside communities to come into Thunder Bay to work, the highways, the clearing, the time frame of getting those highways cleared can vary from one storm to the next. And so even buses are being canceled for school in the mornings are a regular thing.
Let me follow up on buses with Eric Miller. There's not the bus service in this province, particularly inner-city bus service, that there used to be. Do you think buses are a thing of the past?
There's no reason why they need to be a thing of the past. Modern technology, you can have Wi-Fi on it. You can make it comfortable. The challenge is the cost effectiveness. We tend to have long distances, as we're talking about, thin markets. So, why did Greyhound leave? Because they couldn't make money, and the government generally is not willing to subsidize it. So, if we acknowledge buses as an essential service to connect particularly smaller communities, government is going to have to invest in it to make it happen. There aren't a lot of other technology options, I think, in many cases. You're not going to be building a lot of rail in long, thin markets. And if you want an alternative to the car, then I think modern buses could be providing the sort of service that you need to fill the gap.
Josipa, what about St. Catharines to Toronto? Is there a bus that does that?
There is. I mean, there is a Flix bus. Yeah, you can do it, and it's pretty cheap. And actually, I just took the bus from Calgary to Banff. It was $11. Don't drive your car. That's what I tell people. But having said that, I'm single. I don't have kids. I'm taking a laptop, not a baby stroller. So there's some constraints. But if I may, Steve, just go back to the point that the mayor raised about safety. Let's go even further, because then this goes into what is possible on the busing side. Safety is not just about getting on the roads and not dying. For sure, the development of a northern transit strategy is to get to the Ring of Fire, to make sure that there's workers getting to the Ring of Fire. How many dead people are we willing to accept on the icy roads of northern Ontario before we build the rail line? That's a serious question that we have to think about. But the other piece of safety, let me remind folks about Western Canada. We're in Ontario, but British Columbia has a highway of tears. And it's called a highway of tears for a reason, Highway 16, because women are dead and murdered on that highway. And they're dead and murdered on the highway because they're hitchhiking and they're getting picked up by predators. That is what happens when we don't have buses, coach, rail, you name it, public mobility services. Since BC Transit started delivering a bus service, just 3 routes, 3 buses, over 5,000 rides. So that shows that there's immediate demand, there's an immediate need, and it is entirely possible, even in low-density communities, to serve not just their ridership requirements, but also save lives. And what is the economic exchange and return on investment on a life not murdered or killed?
That's a real hard question to ask and to answer, but Mayor Landry, those are the kinds of facts you and your colleagues have to consider when deciding how many billions of dollars we can afford to spend to improve the infrastructure network in our cities, towns, and provinces. What do you come up with when you ask those hard questions?
Well, it's interesting because, the transit systems in the other part of the province, other than Northern Ontario, are subsidized to a great extent. In Northwestern Ontario specifically, I won't speak to Northeastern Ontario, the subsidies are not the same. The subsidies look different in this application for funding for municipalities to bring seniors to the large urban centers. It's not the intercommunity connection that needs to be subsidized for the reasons that were mentioned by Josipa, like exactly that. To say, I still know, I foster parent for many years, and I still know some of our young women are hitchhiking from Kenora to get to Thunder Bay. And it makes me cringe all the time, knowing how many women go murdered and missing. And that's a huge piece of factor of safety too, right? But on our weather systems up here are so different. We can literally have 4 seasons in one weekend. Just had one, matter of fact. So it's safety on the highways is another consideration, but the subsidies for the province of Ontario has to flow a little bit further than just an application from municipalities who are able to find a partnership with a private subsidy or private partner to offer services, because as Eric Miller mentioned, that it's low ridership. So Greyhound was great. I grew up in Nipigon and I went to high school in Red Rock. And if I missed the school bus that morning or stayed a little longer in the coffee shop, I could pay $6 and take the Greyhound into Red Rock and be at school, shortly after start time. That's non-existent anymore. So even with the Northlander coming through, it's not hitting our smaller communities that are off the highway.
No, those days are gone, to be sure. Now, Eric Miller, if you're starting in Windsor, Ontario, and you want to go sort of within about an hour of the U.S. border, all the way east, all the way to Ottawa, I mean, that's a fairly well-served area by both roads and transit, is it not?
Well, it's yes and no.
Yes and no, okay.
Because you're dependent on the 401, which is a horrible highway to drive, particularly west of Toronto. But it will connect you, and it is a high-speed road. The train service, the VIA service, Its main problem is it's not reliable. So there's, on paper, there's fairly good service. It could be more frequent, and ideally it should travel a little bit faster. But the big problem is reliability.
Reliability as in arriving on time?
Arriving on time.
Mm-hmm.
And the big problem there is, by and large, the trains share the tracks with the freight traffic. And the freight traffic is always going to have priority because they own the tracks. And so, the best way we could do to speed up the travel time from, let's say, Toronto, Ottawa, is just to arrive on time instead of half an hour or 45 minutes late. But that's not as easy a thing to solve as we think. So yes, the service is there, but it's not sufficiently attractive in most cases, or many cases, for people not to fly or drive instead.
Josipa?
Yeah, if we can add some numbers to it, and actually I disagree that it's not as easy as it sounds. I think with political will, it is actually potentially that easy. To put some numbers on it, Via Rail transported about 5 to 6 million people in a given year pre-pandemic, roughly still there if we're going to go post-pandemic. Metrolinx moves about 40 to 50. Pre-pandemic, 60 million.
50 million.
Okay. If you go to the Netherlands, it is 5 times that amount, about 430 million in a similar kind of geographic zone. So it's entirely possible to move a lot of people in a short period of time across a large distance. And if we look at the corridor from Windsor to Quebec City, the issue here is the right-of-way. And there was a private member's bill raised earlier this year by an NDP member of Parliament. And it's not kooky, and it's not outlandish, and it's not left-wing radicalism of some sort if people are opposed to the nature of the origin of it. The idea is that CN and CP would pay fines if they blocked Via trains from arriving on time. Totally legit. Why? Because Amtrak's been doing it for 50 years, and they have right-of-way. So CP and CN do bow down to Amtrak in the United States because legislation says you must. It is entirely feasible and intellectually possible and constitutionally possible to do the same thing in Canada, especially given that CP and CN's track was laid by taxpayer-subsidized funds in the past century. So this is not a radical concept for us to raise as Canadians. And given our immigration rates, our population, our congestion, is something that we're obligated to start looking at.
Well, let me ask Eric in North Bay. How do we get from where we are to the vision of the future that Josipa has just outlined?
Political will is a big one. I would say connecting people to the places they need to get to would be a start. I mean, here in Northern Ontario, when I go up to see my partner in Thunder Bay, I take the train from Sudbury to White River, and I got to wait for my partner to pick me up there because there's no connection. There's no practical connection to transfer to the bus to get me to Thunder Bay. So I'm stuck waiting 9 hours between the arrival of the train and the departure of the bus. I wait beside a restaurant outside a highway because it's closed in the middle of the night. I have to carry my luggage in hand between the train station to the bus stop. So I think making transit simple to use, easy to use, reliable, affordable, and comfortable, so that people will make that conscious effort to use it as opposed to driving.
Well, Mayor Landry, let me do a follow-up on that, because I think it was a little over a decade ago that the government of Ontario Premier Dalton McGuinty canceled the Northlander. They said it was simply too expensive to keep going, and therefore it doesn't exist anymore. Now, the current government, in its wisdom, has decided to try to resurrect it, and apparently contracts were recently awarded for station shelters and so on. How have we suddenly been able to afford something today that we were told a decade ago we simply could not afford to subsidize anymore?
Well, it's exactly that, political will, and the will and willingness to put down the subsidies to the northwestern part of the province so that we can too be offered the ability to choose different types of transportation in between our communities. And so it's about political will. And yes, it's going to cost money. Northwestern Ontario people are Ontario citizens too, who pay tax dollars as well. And the subsidies should be flowing this way as well. And it's political will. And, there's a start place going on right now, and we just need to tweak it and find out how do we connect the communities that are off the main line.
Eric Miller, I've got a real nasty question for you, which is we have a finite amount of money to invest in different transportation infrastructure projects. If we can't afford everything, can't afford to build everything we want all over the place. would resurrecting the Northlander, in your view, be the wisest expenditure for those billions?
That is a nasty question.
I warned you ahead of time.
Yeah.
I gave you the heads up.
And, part of our problem is we have not been investing in both urban and inner city transit for so long, and we have such a catch-up that it is very daunting. I think, yes, probably, as a backbone to then build around. But to Eric's point, we also have to think about it as an entire network, the connectivity, so the Northlander will connect major points. How do people get to and from that, from the remote communities? And so thinking about the overall service and thinking about it from the user point of view. So we have to be designing a service. Just building a rail line, that's a great first step. But then how do people get to and from it? The same thing is true in sort of the southern corridor as well. It's the first mile, last mile, and that's where, again, technology and different types of services can help us connect, have that train really connect the communities together.
So this is an age-old problem.
Yeah.
You've got 90% of the population of the province living within an hour of the U.S. border, but you've got people like Mayor Landry and like Eric Boutillier who are in Northern Ontario who feel that they're not getting their share of the pie. So how do we resolve all that?
Well, I'll take it back to the Northlander discussion here and then talk about the integration. The first thing is, if you're Doug Ford right now, you've staked your reputation in part on the Ring of Fire.
Yep.
And if you go to the Ministry of Transportation's website and take a look at their rail strategy or their strategy for Northern Ontario, there right in the middle is a picture of the Ring of Fire. Why is it there? Because you can't get workers to the Ring of Fire. You cannot get people to work in those mines. You cannot get them into the supply chain. Who is going to drive from Toronto and from Windsor to work in the Ring of Fire?
Well,
and to make
you
all
had two
that
levels
money?
of government arguing for 10 years over who's going to build the roads.
Well, exactly. So if you have staked your reputation on extraction of those minerals for an electrification industry of the future, you're going to have to build rail out and the integrated system. So then that speaks to the integrated system, like definitely it's going to be worth the billions because the income tax that presumably, and the corporate tax that should be coming back into our pocketbook. But even if we take that out of the picture, very low-hanging fruit that is Canadians, we have available tomorrow already. The fact of the matter is we have transit systems, public transit systems operating along the backbone of the Metrolinx line and all of VIA. Right now, today, when you get onto one of those transit systems from Kingston all the way down to Hamilton, your Presto card tells Metrolinx a lot about you when you get on. You get off your bus onto your train, but that data does not flow the other way. Every transit agency we work with, 22 agencies across that Metrolinx line, do not get information going the other way, telling them when our passengers are arriving, who are they, what kind of clientele do we have. So how do you get Burlington's buses and Oakville's buses to arrive right on time when you're not getting the data to come back? That is an immediate solution tomorrow. And for VIA, it's the same thing. There's no information sharing between VIA and local transit that already exists. If that happened, I guarantee to you we'd know a lot more about our clientele. We'd have more clientele to appeal to. The buses would know how to arrive and when to arrive, and poor Eric would not be stuck out behind a restaurant in the middle of nowhere because there would be a bus that had been given the information on that clientele.
Mayor Landry, do you see a future where you have hope that trains will once again come into Thunder Bay from around Ontario?
Well, Steve, we used to have the Via Rail that used to come into Thunder Bay right now, but now it goes to Armstrong, Ontario, which is 3 hours north of Thunder Bay. So you have to find a way to get to Armstrong in order to take the Via to get either to go east or to go west. So I'm hoping that there's a political will to someday put forward. We still have train tracks here. We still have the CNCP rail lines going through these areas and these communities. So, if there's a political will, upfront costs and long-term gain, we have a lot of jobs available in Northwestern Ontario. We believe that we are the future of Ontario because we have the natural resources and we have the abilities to produce natural resources, whether it's mining, forestry, lithium, the Ring of Fire. We believe that we're the future of Ontario, and we can help out. And so, if there's political will to help us out in bringing that train system this way, then I think it's possible. Eric
Boutillier, I think I know. If you wanted to drive to Toronto from where you are in North Bay, you're looking at 4 hours, something like that. Does that sound right?
Yeah, 3.5, 4 hours. Yeah.
Okay. If you wanted to fly it, how much would it cost to fly?
Oh, geez. I mean, you're probably looking at about $600-700.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So is there a way, I mean, obviously, that's beyond the means of a lot of people, particularly if you need to do it multiple times. So the question becomes, is there something that some policymaker or some government can do, or is there something that the private owners of these airlines can do to make that more within reach of people's pocketbooks. What do you think?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's I compare a one-way ticket to fly between North Bay and Thunder Bay. I've looked at it before. You're looking at about $775 each way. At that price, I can get a vacation return flight to the Caribbean for on that price. Like, it's air travel, particularly to in Northern Ontario is challenging, because you have the way it's set up is you fly between the community point A to point B, but you're not serving those intermediate communities in between. So a lot of the smaller towns get left out. And I mean, we've seen Bearskin Airlines pull out of Kapuskasing when the town ended its subsidy. We've seen Dryden, Fort Francis, Kenora also lose air service because just not enough demand. And I think price point is just a huge factor for people trying to get from point A to point B.
Yeah, Eric, I don't know, Eric Miller, I don't know if there are any alternatives, because the fact is you can probably fly to Paris or Berlin for the same as it costs to fly from here to North Bay, but it's supply and demand. There's not enough people who want to go from here to North Bay. There's lots of people who want to go to Europe.
Yeah, again, it's the density, the thickness of the market, and just the cost of operating airplanes and fuel and everything else.
Anything be done about that or no?
Well, we can't shrink the geography, can we? So, coming back to your other question, the government has to decide where subsidies make sense and help airlines become more efficient. But it's not an easy problem to solve, and so.
I would add, maybe there are some case studies, and I know we want to say government needs to invest, and this is true. Like, to put some numbers on it, we bought for over $10 billion a pipeline, and now it's ballooned to $30 billion. We've put only about $2.5 billion into transit federally and under $1 billion in high-frequency rail. So just in order of magnitude, we need about 10 times as much investment federally in high-frequency rail as to meet what we invest right now, let's say, in a pipeline.
That was a national unity project, though. Yeah, that was not an economic
arguably
project.
So would be a rail be, right? Arguably.
Right, good
But
point.
even if we take it out of government subsidization, we look at what can corporations do. There is very strong evidence in Southeast Asia, and in Europe that where airlines partner with rail or coach or bus services, they increase their volume and decrease their prices. Now, obviously, you're looking at high-density areas, but there's evidence for the smaller, low-cost carriers and also the short-haul flights. So although we usually think of rail competing with airline, which is the goal, ultimately, for environment, you can envision, and in fact, there's good evidence that the partnerships between rail and bus into Porter Airlines, or rail and bus into Bearskin, or rail or bus into any short-haul flight would actually increase the volume of riders. Not massively, but it would still do something to that price point.
Can I ask you about another mode?
Yeah.
You're in St. Catharines.
Yeah.
I bet it would be much easier, rather than trying to go home, Uber to train station to Union Station subway to here, some kind of ferry across Lake Ontario.
Absolutely.
Why do we not have any of that yet?
Well, there's 3 new mobility modes that have to happen. One is ferry, for sure. We only really have ferries operating out in British Columbia. If you go to Sydney Harbour, ferries are an integrated part of the Sydney transit system, and they are globally well established. It has been not lack of political will, it's been lack of corporate leadership, frankly, to realize the level and the scale of ridership. Plus, post-pandemic now, you have such a growth in the population in the Niagara region that would use that. It's starting to make ferries look reasonable from a corporate investment standpoint. The second is gondolas. In Toronto and Canada, we have not even looked at gondola technology. Gondola technologies have been deployed in South America. They scale over large cities that cannot be built out. They're not expensive. They're a fraction of
gondola. This is like towers with wires and
that's
cable
right.
cars.
We think about gondolas as ski gondolas, but gondolas are used around the world as public transit. They don't rip up roads. You don't need tunnels, and they transport as many people as rail. In many cases, it is low-cost solution building. And the third one is on-demand transit. So I took an Uber this morning because I was a bit lazy. But if I had planned just 15 minutes more, I could have taken St. Catharines Niagara Region Transit on demand. And everywhere in Canada where transit has like an Uber-like style service, it's a fraction of the price, a few minutes longer, and it gets you to your transit hub run by the public sector. These are all mobility technology modes that work. They work around the world, and there's no reason why we can't implement them in Canada.
Mayor Landry, the reality reality is if we want to make improvements here, we are looking at multiple tens of billions of dollars of investment. And people don't want to pay any more taxes, and governments, are hearing it up the yin-yang about that. So where do we get this money to make all these investments from?
Yeah, it's a great question that we're always trying to put forward, and the subsidies is a big piece. And we understand it. We don't have the population in Northwestern Ontario necessarily to meet the demands of intercommunity transit. But we've talked many times and put out solutions from a NOMA perspective when we talk about the fuel tax, for example, to reduce the costs of flying in between our communities. Would bring down the costs to the airlines so that our riders can pay a lower price. I fly from here to Sault Ste. Marie on Bearskin quite often. If I had alternate options, I might potentially take them, but right now you're looking at almost anywhere from $800 to $1,000 from here to Sudbury or Sault Ste. Marie. And even though that might be the quickest route, it might not necessarily be the cheapest route. So when we talk about fuel tax and reducing the fuel taxes to the airlines, we're hoping that maybe that would make a difference as well.
Eric Boutillier, we've talked about the fact that, I think, Josipa, you said there's about 80% of the people still taking cars, 20% in transit. So we're a car culture still. In spite of everything, we seem to be a car culture still. Is there a way to, incentivize car use, incentivize sharing, incentivize, governments, private sector participants to improve the state of the physical infrastructure of the roads, since that's the way most people are going these days? I don't know. I'm asking you.
It really depends where you live. In Southern Ontario, you have a grid-like network where you can take detours to get around traffic or collisions on the road. In Northern Ontario, you need a made in Northern Ontario solution to address some of those issues. Right now, when Highway 1711 closes between Nipigon and Thunder Bay, the country is quite literally split in two. You have to go through the U.S. to detour. You have rest stops in Northern Ontario that are usually closed to the public during the winter. They're not maintained. Cell service in this region is very patchy or non-existent. You run into situations where my girlfriend and I were driving back from White River to Thunder Bay. We saw 3 moose cross the road. We saw a bear grazing on the side of the road. Fortunately it was daylight, but it just goes to show there's a lot of hazards out there that if people in this region are unable to drive, the automobile may not be. It just may not be a workable solution for them long term.
Right. I must confess, it's been a long time since I saw a bear or a moose at Yonge and Eglinton here in Midtown Toronto. So you make a fair point there. And also, I do remember the former NDP leader Howard Hampton saying this province is so big. Sometimes for him to get back to his riding in Kenora, he used to fly to International Falls, Minnesota, and then drive from there, because that was the easiest way to go. This is a big place. I want to thank the 4 of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views on this. Mayor Wendy Landry from Shunea, Ontario. Eric Boutillier, Northern Tracks is his publication. Josipa Petric, President CEO, Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium. And Eric Miller, Director of the University of Toronto Mobility Network. It's great to have all 4 of you on our program tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Good.
Nicholas Kristof is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the New York Times. His gripping new memoir, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, takes us behind the headlines of some of the most defining events of our lives, including the Tiananmen Square protests, genocide in Darfur, a civil war in Yemen, and closer to home, the addiction and despair faced by working-class America. And all that brings Nicholas Kristof back to our airwaves tonight from his farm in Yamhill, Oregon. And Nick, it's great to see you again. How you doing?
Great to be with you again. Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. I want to start at the very beginning here and take you back to 8th grade at Yamhill Grade School. And the notion then that you might someday become a writer/journalist because you were interested at that time in overthrowing the patriarchy. Tell us that story if you would.
So the little country school that I went to, Yamhill Grade School, had a rule that boys could wear blue jeans, but girls could not. And so, as a editor of our little grade school newspaper, I championed their cause, and sure enough, the school changed the rules to allow girls to wear blue jeans. I was pretty caustic in my editorial, and this was my entry into journalism. I was so impressed. This was a way to meet girls, to impress eighth grade girls, and, as you say, to overthrow the patriarchy.
And change the world in the process, eh? That's where it all started?
It really is. And, it was a window, more seriously into the ability of journalism to project issues onto the agenda and get people to think about injustices, whether it's genocide in Darfur or eighth grade girls not being able to wear blue jeans.
You did move up the ladder at the New York Times and have covered some of the most incredible events that we have seen. And let's start with the Tiananmen Square protests and massacres in June of 1989. How close do you think you came to being killed yourself during that time?
Too close. I was in that crowd that the troops opened fire on. And, most people in the crowd weren't killed, but plenty were. And you just never forget seeing a modern army turn its weapons of war onto unarmed protesters. And I've got to say that that left a deep impression on me, but something else left a deep impression on me that night. I had been a little disdainful, a little condescending to some of the peasants from the countryside who had joined the democracy protests on the basis that, well, they say they're for democracy, but they can't really define democracy. They don't know what institutions they want, and so on. There was an element of truth to that. But that terrible night when the troops opened fire, it was those uneducated peasants, the less educated workers who took their rickshaws, and every lull in the firing, they drove out toward the troops and picked up the kids, the bodies of the kids who'd been killed or injured, and then frantically pedaled them to the hospitals. And they may not have been able to define democracy, but they were willing to risk their lives for it. And, these days, as American democracy is under pressure, I think that there's a lot that we can learn from their courage and persistence to try to get that democracy.
I know that you talked to people at the time who thought democracy coming to China was an historical inevitability. And here we are 35 years later, and I don't know anybody who thinks democracy coming to China is an inevitability. Does anybody there still believe democracy is going to happen someday?
Oh, yeah, I think they think it'll happen someday, but nobody's going to put a timetable on that. And that's kind of how I feel. I mean, I've covered democracy movements all over the world, from Poland in the early 1980s, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia. And what I've learned is, in the short run, when you have people of principle going against people with machine guns, the machine guns are likely to prevail. But in the long run, when people get more education, when there is more of a middle class, they aspire to, just as they choose among 5 different kinds of coffee at a coffee shop, also to help choose the kind of governance that affects their lives. And I think that will come to China. I think it will come to Russia. But when, I have no idea.
One of the things that we've learned doing this program over the years is that we can spend a lot of time doing subjects that are important, and not that many people will watch them. And Afghanistan is a great example. We had Canadian troops there for 20 years, and every time we did a program on Afghanistan, our ratings went down. We still did them because we thought it was important, but okay, you know what I'm getting at here. You have the same problem in private media at the New York Times. You want to write about a column about some very worthy things and places that you've covered, and the bean counters at the New York Times are not thrilled with your notion of duty in those cases. What do we do about that?
I mean, I should first of all defend the bean counters in that they've been very willing to let me go cover stories like the Yemen humanitarian crisis, like Darfur, and write columns that pretty much only my mother reads. But we do have a broader problem, that the business model for an awful lot of the media is collapsing, and everybody has better metrics to gauge the audience, and it's becoming more clear that audiences don't care so much about these stories that are expensive to cover and sometimes dangerous to cover. And so I think that part of the answer is going to be philanthropic funding in some cases. I think that I mean, this isn't so much international funding, but in terms of local journalism, I think that there may be some government support that will come through to help local newspapers just stay alive. Right now in the US, 2 newspapers are going bankrupt every week. And I hope the public will also hold our feet to the fire, our feet as, news organizations, and make sure that we cover really important stories, even if they don't have a built-in audience, and push us to try to tell these stories in engaging ways that will help get a few more readers. They are important. If we don't cover them, they just won't get addressed.
Mm-hmm. I do want to take you back to April of 1997 and the moment in a plane that is about to crash that you are in. Do you want to tell us? I mean, this is the craziest story I read in your whole book. The notion, why you were in that plane to begin with, why you were crashing, and why there was half a body hanging off the plane. You want to tell that story?
Yeah. So this was in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide. There was an enormous humanitarian crisis building in the Democratic Republic of Congo, what actually was then Zaire. And ultimately, 5 million people would die in that civil war in Zaire/Congo. It's the most lethal conflict since World War II. And so the UN chartered a plane to carry, I think it was 18 journalists, into the heart of Congo to cover that. We had a crazy American pilot who was taking this small plane, and he landed in Goma in eastern Congo. And there was this, there's not a lot of entertainment in Congo. So there was this enormous crowd of people playing chicken with a plane on the runway. And we just landed and they parted. Then we did some business in Goma. An hour or two later, we got to the end of the runway. The pilot took off, and again, the crowd reassembled. And then he thought they were all going to part. One guy was on the runway and evidently didn't know what the game was, and he didn't move. And our plane hit him, killed him instantly. The pilot, he was a very technically proficient pilot. He was able to still get the plane in the air, but this had collapsed the right landing gear. It had broken the cables that carry hydraulic fluid, the pipes that carry hydraulic fluid. So we lost control of the plane. He didn't want to try to land where he had just killed somebody. And that's how we ended up, crashing in a field. And it does underscore just how so much of journalism is actually getting to the story, trying to figure out how you get there. And then, of course, equally important, get back.
Well, let me follow up on that, because you point out in the book you've taken a lot of risks, maybe you haven't crossed the line, but you've sure snuggled up close to it in taking personal risks to get the story out. Is there ever a story that you've covered that you felt was worth dying for?
Not worth dying for, but taking risks that might end up with death. Yeah, I mean, the Darfur genocide was something that hundreds of thousands of people were being killed. Women were being raped en masse and then mutilated so that they would be forever scarred and stigmatized as rape victims. And this was a government that was, organizing a militia to target 3 specific ethnic groups. I visited villages that had been burned, bodies thrown in wells to poison those wells. And I certainly tried to keep myself alive. And of course, when I'm reporting, I'm risking not only my own life, I'm risking my interpreter's life, my photographer's life, my driver's life. And so we have a responsibility to look after them as well. But when you see those massacres and that kind of genocide, then you want to fight back with everything you have. And my tools to fight back are my laptop and my camera. And so I fight.
Understood. Nick, get comfortable for a second, because I want to read a couple of excerpts from your book, and then we'll come back with a question. I want to invest journalism with purpose and harness it to a cause larger than ourselves. I envision journalism not just as a technical craft, but as one with an ethical mission, a better world. That's risky, I know. It can backfire and undermine journalistic credibility, for one journalist's moral purpose is another's megalomaniacal crusade. I want to dig a little deeper on this issue of journalistic credibility because you, of course, go on to describe an incident with Donald Trump, who was visiting the New York Times office at the time, and he said on the record that he was going to impose a 45% tariff on all Chinese goods, and you reported it, and then Mr. Trump does what Mr. Trump does. He denied ever having said it. And here's the next excerpt. That's wrong, Trump said. They were wrong. It's the New York Times. They are always wrong. So, you write, we released the audio of Trump calling for the 45% tariff on Chinese goods. While there had been many venal politicians around the world whom I deplored, Trump was unique. He was a con artist. I had never known an American politician so uneducated about policy, so self-absorbed, and so deceitful. Okay, how do you fairly cover someone who, in your own words, is so awful and deceitful?
So traditionally in journalism, and as you know, we honor two principles. We try to be fair, and we try to convey the truth. And fairness, we attempt to master by quoting people on each side. And normally that works to project truth, that, people can figure out what is going on. But it doesn't always work. And it didn't work in the civil rights era, for example, to quote Martin Luther King Jr., on the one hand, and a civil rights leader and a governor like George Wallace on the other. The public didn't understand where the truth lay. And likewise, I think we in the media in 2016, when Trump was running, I think we let them down. We quoted people on each side. Trump was good for cable television in particular. He brought in eyeballs. And we didn't convey the truth, which was what we knew, which was that he was lying out the kazoo. So how do we do that? I think it's what we do as foreign correspondents when we cover Vladimir Putin, when we cover Xi Jinping. We quote them. We say that Putin says he isn't invading Ukraine, but that he's engaging in a special military operation, et cetera. But we also make sure that our audiences understand what Putin is actually doing in Ukraine, or what Xi Jinping is doing in terms of domestic repression. And, there's no algorithm that can precisely explain how to do that, but we have our paramount responsibility is to convey the truth to our audiences as we best understand it, with a lot of humility about our ability to master that truth. And I think that is going to be a real challenge for the American media this year.
Well, okay, let's follow up on that, because I take your point of what you're trying to convey there, but we don't live in a world where the truth often matters. We live in a world where everybody's got their own version of the truth, and, we only need look at the Trump trial just ended, where he's found guilty on 34 counts, and his base is even more firmly in his corner. They're more convinced of your culpability in somehow lying about his circumstances. And he may actually have gone up in popularity despite having been found guilty of all those counts. How do we, this seems like a nonsensical world in which we're living in right now. How do we even navigate these waters?
So I think it's hard. And in the short term, we will not be persuasive much of the time. But I have seen that, over time, truth does have a way of rising to the top. I think it helps when journalists don't come across as disdainful to working class Americans or disrespectful toward people of faith. I think we sometimes lose people for those reasons. I think that, again, kind of goes back a little bit to this gulf between the educated and those who are less educated. So I think, we can try harder. I would like to see, I think that when there are conservative opinion pieces in the New York Times escorting my own liberal views, I think they give my liberal views more credibility. I think they actually help me get that message across. But it's hard. And this year is going to be a particular test of that. And there are, I think the best of journalism this year is some of the best that I've ever seen in my life. But the bad journalism out there is as bad as I've ever seen it.
Well, you've done some of the best journalism, I'm happy to say, and I want to refer to your latest column for the New York Times, where you offer up this insight about what's going on in the Middle East right now. You write, "We think of moral issues as involving conflicts between right and wrong, but this is a collision of right versus right." Tell us more about what you meant by that.
So I look at what Israel has achieved economically and in terms of governance at home, not in occupied territories, but within Israel. And it's impressive. And Israeli parents have the right to raise their children without being shelled from Gaza or from Lebanon, without being afraid of car bombs. But Palestinians as well have a right to raise their children without fear of bombs, American-made bombs in many cases, being dropped on them by Israel. Having their homes destroyed, their schools attacked. They have the right to their state as well. And so that's what I mean, that, there's this tendency, I think, too often to have people value human rights on the Israeli side of the border or to value human rights on the Gaza side of the border. But unless you care deeply about human rights in both Gaza and in Israel, then you don't actually care about human rights.
That is a nuanced view in a world that wants you to take sides. I'll ask the same question. How do we navigate those choppy waters in this kind of world?
Well, so it's okay to take sides, but above all, what we need to be is not pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel, but anti-massacre. That's the side that we need to be on. Anti-massacre, anti-starvation, anti-terrorism, wherever that terrorism comes from, and just have to think above all about the common bonds of humanity that link us all together, whatever our nationality.
You offered up a roadmap of 20 different ways to think about the war. I don't know that we've got time for all 20 here, but you want to lay a few on us?
Yeah, I mean, I think they all kind of flow from this notion that too often we are devaluing one side or the other. And what we're not focusing on adequately is the humanity of both. And, I've reported a lot in Israel over the years. Israelis had the right not to be invaded on October 7th and killed and raped by Hamas fighters. And Palestinians, half of the people in Gaza are under 18. There has to be some presumption that children on both sides of the border are innocent. And while I think Israel had every right to respond militarily in some form after October 7th, I don't think they had the right to starve people in particular. And, in my column, I've run a photo of a child who died from starvation. I think we have to focus above all on practicalities, what is actually going to be more likely to lead to peace down the road in ways that will protect the well-being of people on both sides. And I don't think that is happening right now in Gaza. And also focus on that common humanity and never lose sight that there are, moms and dads and children on each side who deserve that protection and deserve that respect.
In our remaining moments here, Nick, I want to follow up on the title of the book, because in spite of the fact that you have seen some of the most miserable, awful things anyone could, you're still chasing hope. You are still optimistic. And I guess I have to find out why that is.
I'm glad you asked that, because, I am this person who's covered war and genocide and poverty and addiction, but emerges with hope. And partly that is because the backdrop I've seen is material and moral progress that we don't always talk about in journalism, but that is real. There's been an explosion in well-being, a huge reduction in child mortality, in illiteracy. And I think what I've also seen is that side by side with the worst of humanity, you invariably find the very best. And if I can just give one example, in rural Pakistan, I met this incredible woman, Mukhtar Mai, who had been sentenced by a village council to be gang raped for an offense that her brother supposedly had committed. This village council carried out that sentence. They gang raped her, expecting that Mukhtar would then kill herself out of shame. And instead, Mukhtar prosecuted her attackers. She sent them to prison, and she used compensation money to start the first school in her village because she believed that education was the best way to chip away at the misogyny and violence that led to her rape. And you just can't leave this little village of Mirwala in Pakistan and talk to Mukhtar and see the children of her attackers enrolled in that school and just not feel fortified by the way we humans, when we are tested, we sometimes are capable of extraordinary resilience and strength and courage and magnanimity. And so the challenges around us are very real, but that is what I hope we can summon to try to address all these challenges around us. That's why I wrote Chasing Hope.
You do confess, though, in the book that you have probably suffered some kind of PTSD over the years, having seen what you have seen. And I wonder whether you ever had a moment where you thought, the emotional toll of bearing witness to all of this is too much. I can't do this work anymore.
So I thought a lot about the toll on my family, on my wife, on my kids. And I worry about that, and you have to find a balance. I mean, I don't want to get killed. I want to get there, but I also want to get back. But when you see the Chinese army mow down protesters, when you see villagers massacred in Sudan, bodies thrown into wells, in Myanmar, when you see the Rohingya, talk to a mom who had her baby plucked from her arms and thrown into a bonfire, you just feel you've got to fight back in every way you can. And so you keep on going down these roads and trying to find witnesses and trying to take pictures and trying to stay alive while doing it, talk your way through checkpoints. And imperfectly, I think it does make a difference. I think journalism matters. Journalism is an act of hope because we think that if we can get that story and project it onto the agenda, it will matter. And not always, but sometimes it does, and we end up better for it.
Well, keep chasing hope, Nick. It was a great book. Absolutely loved it. Can't recommend it strongly enough. And we're so glad you spent some time with us on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Good to be with you.
Here's a look at something we're working on.
My wife and I decided there's more we can do in the community, so we opened a bookstore. And then I said, geez, we're doing some good stuff, but what are the other great small towns of Ontario doing? What can I learn from them?
That's coming up on The Agenda.